We begin tonight with the ongoing crisis in Ukraine. Tensions are high after Russian allied troops seized Ukrainian military facilities in Crimea. Earlier this week, Moscow approved a treaty enabling the region to join Russia. On Thursday, President Obama announced further sanctions on Russian officials and financial institutions.
Probably, Steve. I fear, actually I think, that we are three steps from war with Russia. 2 steps from a Cuban Missile Crisis. Those 2 steps, and both are being discussed in Washington and Moscow, would involve, as many advocate, moving NATO troops to the Polish-West Ukrainian border. I don't know how serious those discussions are, only that aircraft are already there and NATO is moving troops around. If that happens, Putin almost certainly would move those 150,000 soldiers he was practicing a week ago and sent back to the barracks inside Russia into south and eastern Ukraine. That would be the Cuban Missile Crisis, and war would be 1 step away. That's my snapshot. There's a postscript. There is, I am 100% certain, a way back and out of this through diplomacy. The Russians have put a proposal forward. So far as I know, the Americans haven't responded.
And what is that proposal?
I need a piece of paper because it's complicated.
Okay,
I hope you don't mind.
No, I don't mind.
I thought about it coming down, and this is what basically the Russian State Department is saying. I mean, the Russian Foreign Ministry is saying. Russia wants, Putin wants, an end to NATO expansion to Ukraine and Georgia. He wants a moderate government in Kiev, kind of non-aligned government, without these people he calls neo-fascists in the government, and a few are there in that government. He wants a continued Russian-Ukrainian economic relationship because that's vital to Russia and Ukraine, and he wants a federalized Ukrainian constitution because that would give the pro-Russian people in Ukraine some say. Now, let me just say briefly what he'd give in return. Because
that was my next question.
Yeah, I know it was. And you're right. I mean, we got to ask. I mean, it's, as Reagan used to say, it takes 2 to tango. Right. Well, I personally can't tango. Putin would, in return, recognize the new Kiev government. He doesn't recognize this government. He won't talk to them. Secondly, he would pledge not to inspire more separationism in Ukraine, because there are regions of Ukraine that wouldn't mind joining Russia. And Russia, would help the Ukrainian economy avoid the abyss on which they stand, possibly by continuing to provide discounted natural gas.
And do you consider that proposal by the Russians reasonable?
I consider it a reasonable starting point. Now, we have our agenda, but that's an offer. Now it's our turn to say what we think about that.
Like Putin or not, you've been saying that for 10 years.
20.
20, right.
I think you can't get out of a bad place unless you know how you got in. I've been arguing since the 90s that the constant expansion of NATO toward Russia's borders, which began under Clinton and is now in the Baltics on Russia's borders, was going to eventually lead to something like this. Ian pointed out something very important, and I think every American interested ought to read Putin's speech. It's easily available in English. And you can disagree with it, but it tells you where he's coming from. Putin used the expression red line, and he has 2 red lines. One is Georgia and one is Ukraine, for geopolitical and historical reasons. We crossed the red line in Georgia in 2008, and there was a small war. He believes, now he may be wrong about this, but he sees in this whole thing NATO coming to Ukraine, and he believes we've crossed a red line, and what you got is what you got. Now, Steve's position, Steve Stefanovich's position, I understand, but if we were deconstruct each thing Steve said, that means that either Putin withdraws from Crimea, kicks it out of the Russian Federation, or there are no negotiations, and I maintain if there's no negotiations with all the tails in Ukraine, provocations every day, snipers, we don't know who they are, all the tails wagging the dog, we could get to war. We have to begin negotiations. And it doesn't begin with Putin, after what he did this week, saying, okay, never mind, I send Crimea back to Ukraine.
But just have me one quick thing here. Do you believe, Steve, that Putin believes that the demonstrations leading to the overthrow of Yanukovych was aided and abetted by the United States?
I don't know, but here's what he does believe, that on February 21, the European Union foreign ministers signed an agreement with Yanukovych that would have kept him in office until elections in December, gotten the protesters off the street, and brought a process of some kind of reconciliation. That document, which Russia didn't sign but signed off of, I mean, it agreed with it, was dead in the water 12 hours later, and he feels the fact that the United States and the European Union did nothing to enforce that document, which led to the...
Yeah. And
indicates our complicity at some level.
Yeah. And it also is indicative, some say, of a failure of American foreign policy,
well,
not to see that opportunity.
I mean, here's the problem, though. I mean, the distance between, I don't want to implicate Ian, he speaks eloquently for himself, so I'll just say the distance between your two Steves is the difference between, I think, war and peace. In Steve Stasanovich's mind, it's Russia and Putin who are responsible for this terrible mess from the get to the go. And I ask you a question, all of us at the table. I mean, I was raised in Kentucky, and they taught us in school, there are two sides to every story. Is there anything true and legitimate that the Russians have said or done in this crisis, including what Putin said in that speech? If so, if there's only that much that's true, that's where you begin to negotiate. But Steve Stasanovich doesn't have a word of legitimacy for anything that comes from Russia. One last word, Henry Kissinger wrote in the Washington Post, March 3rd, I think.
Well, he was on the show for 45 minutes
well,
the night before.
I hope he said it, because it was one of the great things he ever said. Demonization of Putin is not a policy. It's an alibi for not having a policy.
You said it on the program first.
Good.
So the war thing we can't settle here. We can, I mean, so where are we going to go?
Well, let's try to move it ahead a little bit, if possible. We have several problems. I agree completely with Ian that American diplomacy hasn't performed well in the last. A lot of statements have been said that are regrettable. Now you have an additional problem.
That was true in Syria too, wasn't it?
Yeah. You have another problem. Putin personally doesn't trust President Obama. He thinks he's irresolute, has a short attention span, and goes back on agreements that he makes on the phone.
How do you know that?
Because it's just well known in the Russian establishment that he feels that Obama hasn't come forward. But the more important point is,
well, what are they doing talking on the phone all the time?
God knows, but
I mean, well, God knows it's serious. I mean, you know, they're just 2 hours here and an hour there.
Maybe they're earning their salaries. They're supposed to talk on the phone. Yeah. But here's the important point. Here's the important point, and I want to shift the focus. Putin does trust the Chancellor of Germany, Merkel, for various reasons. She speaks Russian, he speaks German. That always helps. She's in a very complicated position. She has a very difficult position. But I will say this, that any negotiation that moves forward, that Russia accepts, will have to be co-signed by Merkel. In other words, Putin is not going to take Kerry's word or Obama's word for this. He's going to say to them, have Merkel call me and tell me she's down with it. Because she talks bad to him and angrily to him.
I mean, just as he's talking to Putin, he's reaching out to her all the time.
Right, you really want to know why he doesn't trust Obama?
Yes.
Okay. So the Obama, just to give you one...
He didn't give us the real reason.
I generally ask questions because I want to know the answer. Yes, go ahead.
Well, you know, Charlie, I have a friend that says that a good question is better than a bad answer.
I agree
and therefore,
with that.
you play the most essential role. I certainly say that. All right, there's several examples, but let's go to the one we all remember, Libya. Libya. The United States said to Russia, supported the United Nations, a no-fly zone over Libya so that Gaddafi can't take his planes up and attack the insurgents. Russia said, now, it's just a no-fly zone. You're not going to bomb Gaddafi. No. And we did, and it led to his assassination. From that moment on, Putin never trusted anything that came out of the White House. Now, he wasn't president then, but he was calling the shots. I mean, and when he said in the speech, you remember this, we have been deceived and betrayed. He used those words, right?
Yes.
Yeah?
Yes.
Do I lie?
No.
And it's the same in Russian and the same in English, right? When a national leader says, we, Russia, have been deceived and betrayed by the United States several times, the least we can do is say, what is he talking about? We don't deceive and betray people. There's some misunderstanding here. Let's sort it out. He's thinking of Libya. He's thinking of the promise that we wouldn't expand NATO. He's thinking of what he did for George Bush after 9/11, when Putin did more for the American war effort in Afghanistan than any NATO country. And what did he get in return? What did he get in return? The United States left the International Ballistic Missile Treaty, which was the bedrock of Russian national security, and Bush then expanded NATO And you know what they told?
But didn't Putin? I mean, didn't Obama come back and began to negotiate
That so-called reset, which people of our generation used to call a détente. Do you know what they said to Putin in Russia? I heard it with my own ears. They said to him, "You are appeasing America. You're an appeaser. It's got to stop." Well, there's a politics in Russia. I mean, there are people
Okay,
around
so
Putin.
let me close on this. Tell me how you see who has influence on Putin, you know, and where is their leverage with him?
There are two groups around him. One wants to keep a good relationship with the West, and they lost on Crimea. They had a debate.
Fair
they
enough.
lost.
Okay.
He went with the other side.
So he's listening with rationality to competing factions within Russia.
I'm not sure which of us is rational anymore with this crowd. Whoever thought it would come to this? Right. But here, the point of it is that the Crimean question has left the station. It's in the Russian Federation, and it's going to stay there in our lifetime. Let's move on. Now, moving on means I hope that somewhere, where we don't know about, serious people from Washington, Moscow, and maybe Berlin are sitting at a table like this, having a conversation that is quite different from what Obama and Kerry and Lavrov or Putin are saying at this moment.